Welcome to this dialogue with Rod Chambers. My name is Lee Mason and I'm the creator of Integral Flourishing, an online course designed to help participants optimize their overall quality of life. The course offers a combination of theoretical models related to human well-being and practical exercises to improve health and well-being. Rod has taken the Integral Flourishing course as a participant and has also helped me to facilitate the course for other participants. Rod, could you please give a short introduction for anyone watching?
Sure. As Lee has mentioned, my name is Roderick Chambers, and I've had the privilege of being a student of the IF course and also facilitating. And I'm really excited about our discussion today, as I have been with the others as well, but really excited today to delve into some of the details around race. So get ready, get ready, get ready.
Well, thanks, Rod. So indeed, we'll be speaking about race within the context of the quadrants. So the quadrants are part of the integral model. And to give everyone an introduction to the element of the quadrants within the integral model, we'll first watch some clips from the Integral Flourishing course, and afterwards we'll use the framework of the quadrants to discuss the topic of race and later racism. The quadrants describe four perspectives we can take on reality, and the more of these four quadrants we include in our view of the world, the more holistic our perspective is. The quadrants are built up as a grid combining two categories: the category of singular and plural, or individual and collective, and the category of interior and exterior, or inside and outside. We can apply the quadrants to various levels of reality, but for now we'll apply the grid to the level of human beings. If we take me as an example of an individual human being, I have an inside or an interior, which is the world of my subjective experiences, such as feelings, thoughts, tastes and beliefs, in which I experience my I-ness, my being me. This individual interior dimension of reality is described by the upper left quadrant. Of course, I also have an exterior dimension to my individual human existence, related to everything about me that is objectively measurable, such as the height and weight of my body, my blood pressure and heart rate, but also all of the behavior that I display. For instance, we can objectively measure how often I exercise, how many hours I sleep, or how often I use the word cucumber. Everything pertaining to this individual exterior dimension of reality is described by the upper right quadrant. Moving from the upper quadrants, which describe the interior and exterior dimensions of a single human being, to the lower quadrants, which describe the interior and exterior dimensions of a collective consisting of more than one human being. To get a sense of the subjective dimension experienced between human beings, imagine that you and I are having a conversation in which we share a feeling of empathic resonance and mutual understanding. Other human beings who are not part of our interaction and our relationship have no access to the we space that you and I are experiencing. It's a reality exclusive to the two of us. Such we spaces of shared experiences occur not only between two people, but also within families, groups of friends, teams of colleagues, and entire cultures. These worlds of shared subjective experience that occur within this collective interior dimension of reality are described by the lower left quadrant. Of course, we also have an exterior dimension to our collective human existence related to everything about our shared world that is objectively measurable, such as 1. Structures or stuff like buildings, clothing, mobile phones and cars, but also 2. Systems such as the economy, philosophical theories, which are systems of organized ideas, and the internet, and 3. Processes such as legal proceedings, wedding ceremonies and recipes. Everything pertaining to this collective exterior dimension of reality is described by the lower right quadrant. In this video, we'll have a look at some practical examples of the domains of experience as they arise within the quadrants. In the slides for this segment, the physical domain of experience is indicated with the letter P, the emotional domain of experience is indicated with the letter E, the mental domain of experience is indicated with the letter M, and the existential or spiritual domain of experience is indicated with the letter S. To make this segment as relatable as possible, we'll apply the quadrants once again to the level of individual human beings. As individual human beings, we experience the upper left quadrant of the individual interior as the I dimension of self and personality. Examples of subjective physical experiences in this upper left quadrant include feeling thirsty, feeling hungry, and having an itch. Examples of subjective emotional experiences in this upper left quadrant include feeling sad, feeling afraid, and feeling joyful. Examples of subjective mental experiences in this upper left quadrant include thinking about an exam, remembering somebody's birthday, and having an idea about a party. Examples of subjective existential or spiritual experiences in this upper left quadrant include believing in destiny, having an ideal of wanting to make the world a better place, and experiencing a sense of purpose in our personal life. As individual human beings, we experience the upper right quadrant of the individual exterior as the it dimension of body and behavior. Examples of objectively measurable physical phenomena in this upper right quadrant include the color of our eyes, our body temperature, and measurable behavior such as scratching an itch. Examples of objectively measurable emotional phenomena in this upper right quadrant include frowning, crying, and laughing. Examples of objectively measurable mental phenomena in this upper right quadrant include the specific words we choose to express an idea, how often we read a book, and how we answer the questions on an IQ test. Examples of objectively measurable existential or spiritual phenomena in this upper right quadrant include how often we pray or meditate, how we treat others who are in need, and what we communicate about our deepest principles. As individual human beings, we experience the lower left quadrant of the collective interior as the we dimension of relationships and culture. Examples of subjective physical phenomena in this lower left quadrant include experiences of intimacy we share while spending time with lovers, experiences we share with a team while playing a game of sports, and experiences we share with friends while eating a meal together. Examples of subjective emotional phenomena in this lower left quadrant include musical preferences we share with acquaintances, experiences of feeling happy with colleagues while watching a stand-up comic, and experiences of mutual fondness we share with friends. Examples of subjective mental phenomena in this lower left quadrant include memories we share with a friend of watching a concert together, the norms we share with members of our culture, and ideas we share with a family member about politics. Examples of subjective existential or spiritual experiences in this lower left quadrant include beliefs we share with a particular religious group, ideals we share with colleagues regarding sustainability, and spiritual experiences we have with friends. As individual human beings, we experience the lower right quadrant of the collective exterior as the its dimension of environment and society. Examples of objectively measurable physical phenomena in this lower right quadrant include swimming pools, national healthcare systems, and exercise schedules. Examples of objectively measurable emotional phenomena in this lower right quadrant include roller coaster rides, scientific theories about emotions, and anger management courses. Examples of objectively measurable mental phenomena in this lower right quadrant include newspapers, national educational systems, and courses for learning how to write scientific articles. Examples of objectively measurable existential or spiritual phenomena in this lower right quadrant include places of worship such as mosques, synagogues, and churches, existential philosophies such as integral theory, and meditation research. This concludes our overview of examples of the domains of experience in the quadrants. So those were a number of clips from the Integral Flourishing course, introducing the quadrants within the integral model. So we'll now use the quadrants as a framework to discuss race and later racism. And we'll use three perspectives. So the first perspective is the broadest perspective, viewing all of humanity as one single race. The second perspective is viewing the subdivisions of races within the human race. And the third perspective is looking at how racism shows up across the quadrants, or can show up across the quadrants. So to start with the first overview of humanity as a single species, if we look in the lower right quadrant, so that's the quadrant of environment and society and collections of human beings. So if we look at the whole humanity as a group of individual human beings, then we can say that from an evolutionary, anthropological, or biological perspective, we can say that humanity is a single species because each fertile adult human male and each fertile adult human female who are not directly related can produce successfully healthy offspring through mating. And we can't do the same with other species or other races, so to speak, so not with other types of animals, so horses or things like that. So that's in the lower right quadrant of environment and society, so the collective exterior. If we move to the individual exterior of body and behavior, then one of the ways that we can say that we're all part of a single human race is by looking at the genetic profile. And the human race basically has one genetic profile where we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. And for instance, other great apes have 24 pairs of chromosomes. So that's one way that we can see in our genetic print, our genetic profile, how we're all part of one species. Then if we look in the lower left, so the collective interior of relationships and culture, then we can say that as a human species, we have a collective experience of being human, which is characterized by, among others, our awareness of the fact that we're mortal, that we will die someday, and also of the fact that we're aware of being aware. And that's why the Swedish biologist Carl Linnaeus identified modern human beings as Homo sapiens sapiens, meaning the humans who know that they know, so who are aware of our own awareness. And that's something we all share as human beings. And then in the individual interior, the upper left quadrant of self and personality, each individual human being experiences physical sensations, emotions, thoughts, beliefs, and these are all shared by all of us as part of our experiences. So that's a very broad introduction of the concept of race within the single human race. So Rod, any reflections on this first perspective?
I think you've covered you've covered everything. No, I think that's fine.
Okay. Indeed. I mean, you and I have had many discussions beforehand, and we've gone in all sorts of different directions. So there is a lot to say indeed, and I know you have a lot to say about it. But as an introductory framework, I agree this is perhaps short and sweet. So
yes, and I think it would just really, for me as a viewer, it would irritate to have unnecessary commentary, at least during this part.
Okay. So that was the first perspective, looking at humanity as one race, as a single species. Now moving to the second perspective, where we look at different races within the one human race. If we again apply the quadrants to this perspective, then we can see that in the lower right quadrant of environment and society, so the collective exterior quadrant, that we can look at humanity as a collection of individuals. And evolutionary anthropologist Barbara King says about this that it's actually better to think about populations instead of races, because the current scientific consensus is that humanity evolved on the African continent and that then populations dispersed across the globe throughout prehistory. So if we then want to understand why different populations within the single human race develop different characteristics, such as different skin pigmentation, then it's useful to look at a comparison. So let's say that we have one group of human beings that remains on the African continent and one group of human beings that migrates to Northern Europe, to the Netherlands, where I'm currently based. Then there are different environmental selection pressures that require different adaptations from those two groups of human beings. And that's because different types, if we're speaking about skin pigmentation, that different types of skin pigmentation produce different types of benefits and also different types of disadvantages. So for the population that remains on the African continent, a darker skin is more beneficial because, especially if we're speaking about the African continent around the equator, then there's intense sunlight for many hours per day. And that intense sunlight is also accompanied by UV radiation. So our skin is then bombarded with UV light, which in the long run can produce skin cancer and all sorts of different skin diseases. But the darker our skin is, the better it is at absorbing that UV radiation and sort of protecting us against skin deformities or skin cancer and things like that. So those selection pressures select for a darker pigmentation in the skin. But in the, let's say, Northern Europe, in the Netherlands, because the days are shorter in relation to the African continent around the equator and the sunlight is less intense, there's a different type of selection pressure. So if you were to have a very dark skin there, then you would be protected against the UV light, UV radiation, but you would not receive enough sunlight that would produce enough vitamin D in your body. So you would have vitamin D deficiencies, and that in turn could produce bone deformities, which, especially if you're a fertile female and the bone deformities are around the pelvis, that could influence your success in reproducing. So basically, a lighter skin in Northern Europe, in the Netherlands, where I'm based, means that your risk of getting skin cancer if you're in the sun too long, in too intense sun, that goes up. So you'd have a larger risk of developing skin cancer, but you also have a benefit of producing more vitamin D than you would be able to do if you had a darker skin. So, and now, of course, in our current day, we can take vitamin supplements, vitamin D supplements. But of course, when we're speaking about these population movements, we're speaking about prehistory when there were no supplements. So these evolutionary pressures explain that there are different benefits to having different skin pigmentation types, and how we can see that within one single human race, we see these different manifestations of humanity because of different selection pressures. So that's within the lower right quadrant. If we then speak about the upper right quadrant of individual exterior, so body and behavior, then we can see that, of course, these, for instance, differences in skin pigmentation, but also differences in hair type, hair structure, bone structure also, that these differences also show up, of course, in our genetic profile. And if you look at the genetic differences between what we could call races, so populations, for instance, with different skin pigmentation, and typically we can see that the differences, average differences, are around 6%. And of course, there's a continual intermixing because we're continually, as a species, people are forming relationships with each other with different genetic and racial backgrounds and so forth. So if we then look at the collective interior, so the lower left quadrant of relationships and culture, then we can see that these different populations that migrate across the globe and that develop their different languages, different rituals in the lower right quadrant, they also develop different ways of perceiving and relating to the world in the lower left quadrant. So for instance, an example of this could be that British people, they tend to gesture when they speak about the past and the future. British people, if they speak about the past, will tend to gesture to their rear, and when they speak about the future, they will tend to gesture in front of them. Whereas Chinese people, in some cases, gesture when they're speaking about the past, they gesture forward. When they're speaking about the future, they gesture backward. So these are different ways that different populations can develop different ways of perceiving reality. Then in the upper left individual interior quadrant of self and personality, we also have, of course, individual experiences of similarities and differences. So for instance, Rod, you and I were just speaking before we recorded about the fact that my experience of my hair, my head hair, is different than your experience of your head hair, just because it's a different structure and it's a different type of hair. So that's the second perspective of races within the human race. So Rod, any reflections on this?
Well, besides the fact that you think that your hair texture is different from mine, I don't see how you can make that assumption. Clearly, our hair type is the same, man. No, I don't think that there's much I'd like to contribute here. I think you did a fantastic job of giving us an overview of the human aspect, the differences among the human races.
Okay, so that was the second perspective of races within the single human race. Now moving to the third perspective of racism between the different races within the single human race. Rod, one of the things that I learned from you when we were speaking previously about this, this subject is that there was this German naturalist called Johann Blumenbach who had a theory about races. So perhaps you could speak about that and lead us into the quadrants, how they relate to racism.
Sure. He was one of the first, as I could recall, that started to separate the races based on color. We have white, yellow, red, brown, and black. And so we start to see more of the social construct, but very much so at the time that he was doing his work as an anthropologist, much of this was not necessarily a social construct as it was heavily imbued into the biological sciences and the anthropological work. And so we start to see a certain kind of transition that happens within the Western society where you see this clear divide of superiority based on, let's say, Eurocentric features. So certain nose frames, mouth structures, eyes, body types, etc. We start to see that this kind of message and this kind of research was pervasive in a variety of industries, education, sciences, politics, religion. So all the kind of core pillars of a civilization, we see this construct appear. And so, as I think one of the obvious things to point out is, again, a person perhaps with a darker skin is considered to be inferior in certain societies. And there's also many kinds of stereotypes that are associated with the person who has perhaps a lighter skinned or the individual who has a darker skin. And part of the association, I mean, I think it's for those who perhaps have experienced Western civilization in the United States in particular, that the adage has been historically that if you had a lighter skin, you were much more intelligent. And if you had darker skin, you were less intelligent. And then, of course, there's a variety of stereotypes and biases in between there, but just to give the more ostensible or explicit kinds of stereotypes that's been created around these ideas with race and then colorism.
Well, thanks, Rod. I think that's a really good introduction indeed to this third perspective of the quadrants, where again we'll start in the lower right quadrant of environment and society, so the collective exterior. Then we can see that for instance, Johann Blumenbach's work, where he speaks of these 5 races, so red, brown, yellow, black and white, that can be used indeed as a sort of a weapon to create societies that are unfairly biased. And if we look at the environment and society in the lower right in relation to racism, then we can say that racism there shows up as different societal policies and different treatment of people based on racial characteristics. And of course, 2 of the most egregious ones are, of course, slavery and apartheid. And as you correctly say, those are typically based on sort of the misuse of science and of observation about genetic or appearance differences between populations within the human race. So if we then look at the lower left collective interior of relationships and culture, then we can see that the different collective beliefs about others based on racial characteristics, that is how racism shows up in that quadrant. And indeed, as you were saying, that there can be either superiority or inferiority beliefs among groups of people, among populations, in relation to their skin pigmentation or in relation to other characteristics that are attributed to race or associated with race. And then indeed in the upper left individual interior quadrant of self and personality, we can see that different individual human beings can have attitudes towards people based on racial characteristics, so they can experience bias. So in the way that we perceive others, we can be biased. And that, of course, in the upper right quadrant of body and behavior, so the individual exterior, that can lead to measurable behavior, so intentionally treating people differently based on racial characteristics or discrimination. So those are the ways that that racism can show up across all of these quadrants. And that's the third perspective that we'll be using indeed to approach this theme of racism. So Rod, any reflections on this?
Sure. I don't know if this is the most appropriate time to mention this, but it's a quote that I've often referred to throughout our conversations, and that is, unity doesn't mean sameness. And I think that as we go through the various levels of the quadrants related to race, I think that that's important to point out, that as we look at someone like Johann Blumenbach's work, that there is a certain, as much of his work has been used to create division, I think that another scope, or it's some way we also have to observe the uniqueness among each one of the groups in order to appreciate what each group or population brings to the table, so to speak. And I think that to expand the conversation so that it's not just looked at as creating this divide, and though racism is very ugly and there's no positive things about racism itself, to expand the ideas of culture and what each race perhaps brings into the diversity of a country or community. I think that we also have to be able to look at some of those other nuances that don't necessarily keep us inferior or superior to one, but really making some significant contributions such as music or food that many of us have grown to appreciate that have been cross-culturally.
Well said, Rod. I really love the phrase, unity does not equal sameness. And I think that integral theory also invites us to see that we can hold the whole at the same time, so see that humanity is one species, and also be mindful of all of the differentiation, all of the individual variation, and also indeed all of the population variations over time that have led to different genetic and different racial backgrounds that each of us, of course, carry with us.
For those who are perhaps for at least reference, I came across Anthony T. Broder. He has one of his texts called Nile Valley Civilizations or something like that, but you can look up Anthony T. Broder, and he's published maybe 5 or 6 different books, but nonetheless, in his texts is where I came across that Johann Blumenbach was instrumental in my words, I'm paraphrasing this, so don't quote me, but he consulted slave owners on how to psychologically break down the slaves. In his text, he was very intentional about correcting the terms that are used as we talk about slaves, that these were individuals who are more like prisoners of war as opposed to slaves. And this is a very important point to make, is because you had what appears to be a population of what ended up being slaves in America that were actually captured people from their civilizations that in some cases also had rank in their civilizations. And so when they were captured, it was more so that they were prisoners of war and then were later sold off as slaves. And I say that this is important because as some of these prisoners of war begin to share their stories and share information about where they came from, and perhaps even their placement in their societies, this seemed to be correlated with the resistance that was happening among other slaves that were brought over to America. And so, from what I understand, Johann was instrumental in just consulting the slave owners that if they then told these Africans that they were slaves and that they did not come from the communities that they came from, then what it did was psychologically form this certain idea that they had no history and that their only history was being a slave and that they were generationally a slave. And that's all that they were essentially meant to be in this new American society. And so, yes, that is correct that Johann, I believe that his work was not conclusive to just focusing on that aspect, but from what I understand, he was a person who was instrumental in providing that kind of consultation to slave owners. Another text to add to that you made me think about was, I don't know if you've heard of Willie Lynch. There's an old book that's, the title is How to Make a Slave, I believe it is, or how, something to that matter. Willie L. Lynch, I believe is his name. And in that textbook, essentially, it's a instructional manual on how to create a slave or how to break a slave. And some say that the book is mythical and that it was created some random, not as long ago. But nonetheless, when you read the textbook, it's not long. He compares the breaking of a slave to the breaking of a horse, and how you break a horse and how you take that wild beast and you then tame it. And so he's given instructions on how to do this to a slave. And part of his methodology in that text refers to the psychology and how you break down the family itself. And one of those ways is that he refers to, you take all the slaves, that the slave owners should bring all the slaves out to the public, and then take the largest of the male slave, then you would attach him to 2 horses. You'd have his arms attached to one part of the horse, and you'd have his legs attached to the other side of the horse. The horses would be faced opposite. Then at the same time, you would slap the horse, and then it would pull the body apart. And then this would, of course, create great levels of fear, great levels of terror, and it sends the implied message that at any point this could happen to you. And there's some other things along the way that you would take then another male, you would tar him and feather him and then burn him publicly. But there was a lot of psychological things that were happening to maintain slaves. The question that often comes up in this kind of discussion is, well, what kept slaves from running away when there was no barbed wires? There were not as many dogs, I presume, but there was essentially several slaves on a plantation, but only a few slave owners. Well, when you institute fear into the dynamic, that fear would then inhibit people or slaves from leaving the plantation.
That is indeed a question that that often comes up also, for instance, in relation to the Holocaust, where, of course, there were large numbers of Jewish people destroyed in the death camps who outnumbered the camp guards, of course, significantly. And there are some documented revolts, and of course, in the case of slave revolts, one of the ones I know of is the Nat Turner slave rebellion. But I also know that, for instance, in the Soviet Union, that in the Gulag system, where political prisoners were kept in camps, that one of the things that Joseph Stalin, the dictator during much of the period of the Gulag, that one of the things he purposefully did was make sure that nobody heard about any of the revolts of prisoners if they occurred. So the army would be sent in if necessary. And because you don't want that sort of information going about, that it's possible indeed to resist or to revolt in those sorts of situations. So, and I think that, or did you want to jump in, Rod?
No, I was going to say it makes sense. I mean, logically, when you think about these things that happen historically, you see these mass amount of people that are being destroyed by very few, and it's easy to again to be logical and practical when it's not hitting home. But it's like there's several of you. How can you just then overthrow anarchy? Something. But again, there's obviously things in place to assure that the few would, this hysteria that was created enough to make sure that people kept bound. So that was it.
And to zoom out, it's also useful to realize that even within populations within the human race that have the same skin pigmentation, that there can also be racism and genocide. So for instance, as you say, indeed, between the Chinese and the Japanese, who have the similar skin pigmentation, and also, of course, in the Holocaust, where whites persecuted the Jews, and also between the English and the Irish, which goes back historically. So the Irish were basically oppressed by the English for a period of approximately 800 years. And of course, the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda, where the genocide happened in 1994, and many much more examples such as that.
Absolutely. It's definitely something that's worldwide. I mean, I'm sure you know this as you are a student of the Chinese culture, the war between Japan and China and the kinds of presence, for lack of a better word, that it's left in both countries. I've yet to go to Japan. I can't wait to go there. But as I've gone across in China, I mean, that for many, especially the older generation, that is something that's extremely sensitive to talk about the wars between the two, and even the feelings that some of them have towards the Japanese. And I've had even some of my younger students in their early 20s, late teens, who have inherited some of that trauma and have transferred, if you will, some of their own animosity towards Japanese. So, it's definitely something that happens around the globe, and can have an adverse and transgenerational effect. I have a friend of mine who's Rwandan?
Yeah, Rwandan.
Okay. And I had an opportunity to ask him about what life was like in Rwanda post that catastrophic event that happened in the early 90s. And something that was really unique that came out of that I learned was that most of them don't have grandparents, and most of them don't have parents. So majority of the population is maybe like 40 and younger. If you have, let's say, a parent, I believe, or a grandparent, you're looked at as like a minority. Like, it's just that you don't have that, since there were so many, deaths. So I thought that was really, really unique. Morbid, obviously, but a very, very different kind of experience. But it was unique for them to talk about some of the advantages. Most of the population, from what I understood, was very technologically savvy. And I thought to myself, what kind of shift would that create for most of your people to be firstly about 40 plus, or maybe, mid 40s, but younger, but then also have the leverage of most of you are technologically savvy within your country. So anyway, just a very different experience, and I'm still wrapping my head around what that experience is actually like for many of them.
Okay, Rod, so what opportunities do you see for us as a human species to deal with racism in the most constructive and most effective way?
Well, I'm going to repeat something I shared earlier, and that is unity doesn't mean sameness. Coming back to the idea that I can appreciate you or anyone else, let's start with the groups first. I can appreciate different groups without bringing my own superior thoughts or consider the competition of, well, our group is better because, or your group is better because. I think your point that you brought up earlier about being an observer, I think is really important, because now I'm intentionally minimizing my judgments as I'm experiencing a thing. And something I mentioned about becoming a student of the experience, that when I take that student role, I'm not looking to tell you how to do it, so to speak, or I'm not looking to even change the experience as it is, that I'm learning, I'm observing, I'm absorbing the experience and just taking it for what it is. I'm not saying that I have to like every experience that every group provides. I think that that would be somewhat counterintuitive, but to have an appreciation for it, I think is really important. And I think that that would be one step forward, or maybe even a couple of steps forward, to minimize racism at its core.
Well said, Rod. And I would also suggest that that's one of the most powerful ways forward for humanity is to learn as individuals how to inhabit the perspectives of other people, irrespective of their appearance and their to which race or to which population they belong. If we can inhabit their perspective as if it were our own, then we can experience empathy and understanding for each individual human being. And that would then, at least from my perspective, bring us back to the first level or the first perspective that we were discussing, and to see that each individual is an expression of one humanity. So each human being is related to each other human being in a very direct genetic and population and species oriented way. So that can highlight the ridiculousness of overemphasizing difference from a perspective of superiority or ignorance.
Indeed, indeed.
So Rod, in conclusion, is there any perspective you have on how humanity can potentially move forward in the most constructive way in relation to racism?
Sure. I think you have a myriad of calls of actions that could be a result of ingesting this kind of information. Because as we go through much of the discussion that we focused on today around race, it can leave you feeling like, so what? Things are the way that they are. It will never change, or perhaps there's no change in my lifetime. And I would like to encourage people to consider going and live in a different country among a people who don't look like you, or perhaps collectively don't think like you, or don't eat the same foods that you eat. As I've discussed in previous videos, I've lived in China for approximately 3 years. And for those who don't know or who can't see, I am clearly not Chinese, but I'd like to think that I have become a part of the culture to some degree as I've lived there. There's many things I had to learn in terms of language, eating new food, living environments, etc., that really added to my experiences as a person and my ability to relate to others who don't necessarily look like me. For those who say that that's just too dramatic, too extreme, go eat at a local restaurant that you perhaps would not normally eat at. A restaurant that perhaps is from a different ethnic group. If that's too uncomfortable, click on some music that you generally would not listen to that has originated from a different group. So there's different ways that we can take, different steps that we can take as a call to action to really start to diversify the way that we show up as a very diverse people.
Well, excellent, Rod. So thanks very much for your sharing and for all of your insights and energy. And thanks everyone for watching. So we'll see you on the next call.
Peace.